The world didn't end with sirens wailing or bombs falling from a darkened sky. It ended with a whisper, a microscopic invasion that turned humanity's own biology against itself. The Cordyceps brain infection, a fungal pathogen that evolved beyond its natural boundaries, represents one of the most terrifying scenarios in the pantheon of human extinction events. Not because it killed quickly, but because it transformed, because it hijacked the very essence of what made us human and turned us into instruments of its own propagation. This is the story of that transformation, told not through the lens of heroism or survival alone, but through the cold, methodical progression of biology meeting civilization, and civilization losing. In the decades before the outbreak, humanity stood at the apex of its technological achievement. We had mapped the human genome, split the atom, and touched the surface of distant worlds. We believed ourselves masters of nature, capable of bending the biological world to our will through medicine and engineering. Yet all our sophistication, all our accumulated knowledge, proved meaningless when faced with a simple truth that ecologists had warned about for generations. Nature always adapts, and it adapts faster than we can predict. The Cordyceps fungus, which had spent millions of years perfecting its invasion of insect nervous systems in the tropical rainforests, found a new host in us, and once it did, the carefully constructed edifice of modern civilization crumbled in less than a generation. What makes the Cordyceps pandemic particularly haunting is not merely the speed of societal collapse, but the nature of the transformation itself. The infected don't simply die, they persist, locked within bodies that no longer respond to their commands, their minds slowly consumed by fungal growth that spreads through neural pathways like roots through soil. They become monuments to our vulnerability, shambling testaments to the fact that consciousness, that most precious and mysterious aspect of human existence, can be overridden by something as simple as a spore-finding purchase in lung tissue. The infected are both victim and vector, tragic and terrifying in equal measure, as we trace the arc of this pandemic from its origins in South American agricultural regions to the quiet, overgrown ruins that now define the former urban centers of North America. We encounter a narrative that is simultaneously biological and societal, microscopic and continental in scope. We will examine the technical mechanisms by which the fungus achieves its takeover of human physiology, the stages of infection that mark the gradual degradation of the host, and the environmental factors that have allowed it to establish permanent colonies in the remains of our cities. We will explore the fractured remnants of governmental authority, the desperate measures taken by those who survived the initial outbreak, and the new forms of community that have emerged in the absence of centralized power. But this is also a story about resilience, about the stubborn refusal of human beings to surrender entirely to extinction. In the gaps between the infected zones, in the carefully maintained quarantine areas and the scattered settlements that dot the wilderness, life continues. Children are born who have never known a world without gas masks and checkpoints, who have never seen the lights of a functioning city or experienced the casual abundance that defined pre-pandemic existence. These children, and the adults who struggle to give them some semblance of childhood despite impossible circumstances, represent the ongoing chapter in humanity's story. They are the ones who must navigate not only the physical dangers of a world overrun by fungal horror, but also the psychological toll of living in permanent crisis, of knowing that every breath could carry spores, that every shadow might conceal something that was once human. The Cordyceps pandemic has fundamentally altered the relationship between humanity and the natural world. where once we saw ourselves as separate from and superior to the ecosystems we inhabited, the outbreak has revealed the profound interconnectedness of all living things. The same ecological principles that govern predator-prey relationships, that drive natural selection and evolutionary adaptation, apply to us as well. We're not exempt from the biological imperatives that shape all life on Earth. The fungus that now stalks us through abandoned streets is simply following its evolutionary programming, seeking to reproduce and spread, indifferent to the civilizations it topples in the process. In the ruins of our cities, nature has begun the slow work of reclamation. Vines climb the facades of skyscrapers, roots crack through concrete and asphalt, and the sounds of human industry have been replaced by the rustle of leaves and the calls of animals returning to territories they abandoned generations ago. In these spaces, the infected exist as part of a strange new ecosystem, neither fully alive nor truly dead, their bodies sustained by the fungus that has colonized them. They congregate in dark, damp spaces where spore colonies can flourish, creating zones of intense biological hazard that will remain dangerous for decades, perhaps centuries to come. These areas represent a permanent transformation of the landscape, regions where human presence can only be temporary and heavily protected. The story of the Cordyceps pandemic is ultimately a meditation on impermanence, on the fragility of the systems we build, and the certainty that all civilizations, no matter how advanced, are temporary structures imposed on an indifferent universe. The skyscrapers that once symbolized human achievement now serve as vertical gardens, their empty windows gaping like the eye sockets of enormous skulls. The highways that connected continents are slowly disappearing beneath encroaching vegetation, their purpose forgotten by those who now travel them on foot or horseback. The digital networks that once pulsed with the accumulated knowledge of our species have gone dark, their servers silent, their data slowly degrading into meaningless noise. Yet within this landscape of loss, there are also moments of profound beauty. A sunset viewed from the roof of a reclaimed building, the taste of fresh vegetables from a carefully tended garden, the sound of children's laughter in a settlement that has managed to create safety within walls of necessity. These moments, small and fleeting as they are, represent the continuation of human experience, the insistence that life has meaning even in the face of overwhelming loss. They are the reason people continue to struggle, to fight, to build and rebuild, even when the odds are impossibly stacked against them. As we begin this exploration of the Cordyceps pandemic and its aftermath, we invite you to consider not only the biological mechanisms and societal structures that define this new world, but also the deeper questions it raises about human nature, about what we value and what we're willing to sacrifice to preserve it. What does it mean to be human when the biological substrate of humanity itself can be hijacked? What forms of community and connection are possible in a world where trust has become a luxury few can afford? How do we maintain hope, purpose, and meaning when the future appears foreclosed, when survival has become an end in itself rather than a means to some greater flourishing? These are the questions that haunt the survivors of the Cordyceps pandemic, and they are questions that will accompany us throughout this examination of their world. The fungus is patient. It has waited millions of years to find its way into human hosts, and it will wait millions more if necessary for the next opportunity. But humanity, for all our flaws and fragility, possesses something the fungus does not: the ability to choose, to adapt not just biologically but culturally, to pass knowledge and values across generations through means beyond mere genetic inheritance. Whether this will be enough, whether the scattered remnants of our species can survive long enough to rebuild something approaching what was lost, remains an open question. But for now, in this moment, people endure. They tell stories, form bonds, create beauty in the margins of catastrophe, and perhaps that, more than any immune response or technological solution, is the truest resistance to extinction. To understand how humanity fell, we must first understand the weapon that brought us down. Cordyceps fungi have existed for millions of years, evolving alongside their hosts in the hot, humid environments of tropical and subtropical regions. The genus Cordyceps comprises hundreds of species, each exquisitely adapted to infect specific host organisms, primarily insects and other arthropods. The most famous of these, Cordyceps unilateralis, targets carpenter ants in Southeast Asian rainforests, compelling infected individuals to abandon their colonies and climb to specific locations where temperature and humidity conditions are optimal for fungal reproduction. Once there, the ant bites down on a leaf or branch in what's known as the death grip, holding the position while the fungus consumes its body from within and eventually erupts through the exoskeleton in a grotesque flowering of spore-bearing structures. This complex behavioral manipulation, orchestrated by a simple fungus, has long fascinated mycologists and neurobiologists. The mechanism by which Cordyceps achieves this control involves a sophisticated chemical invasion of the host's nervous system. The fungus produces a cocktail of neuroactive compounds that interfere with the normal signaling between neurons, effectively hijacking the host's motor control while leaving basic life functions intact long enough for the infection to complete its life cycle. Research in the years before the pandemic revealed that these compounds could cross the blood-brain barrier and bind to specific receptor sites in the insect brain, triggering behavioral changes that were entirely in the fungus's interest rather than the host's. The critical question that occupied researchers studying Cordyceps was whether such a mechanism could ever affect mammals, let alone humans. The prevailing scientific consensus held that the evolutionary distance between insects and mammals was simply too great, that the neurological complexity of the mammalian brain would prove resistant to such crude manipulation. This confidence was rooted in the observation that Cordyceps infections in nature showed extreme host specificity. Each species of Cordyceps had evolved over millions of years to exploit the precise neurochemistry of a particular host organism. The leap from insect to mammal seemed to require an implausible cascade of evolutionary innovations, changes that would take geological timescales to accumulate. This assessment proved catastrophically wrong, though through mechanisms that even post-pandemic researchers are still working to fully understand. The best current interpretation, based on analysis of early outbreak samples and epidemiological data, suggests that the mutation event occurred not in the wild, but in the context of industrial agriculture. Large-scale monoculture operations in South American regions provided exactly the conditions that could accelerate fungal evolution. Massive host populations in close proximity, extensive use of fungicides that created selective pressure for resistance, and the presence of stressed, immunocompromised hosts that might prove more vulnerable to experimental infection attempts. Based on what we know about fungal genetics and the early spread patterns of the pandemic, we can assume that multiple independent mutations accumulated in Cordyceps populations that were living in close association with commercial crop fields and food processing facilities. These facilities, with their controlled temperature and humidity conditions, may have inadvertently created ideal experimental environments for the fungus to test new strategies of infection. The presence of both insect pests and human workers in these spaces could have provided opportunities for the fungus to attempt cross-species jumps that would never occur in natural settings. Most such attempts would have failed, producing dead-end infections that never established themselves. But in the vast lottery of genetic variation that occurs with each spore release, eventually a combination emerged that could not only infect human tissue, but could replicate and spread. The first documented cases of what would later be recognized as Cordyceps Brain Infection appeared in 2013, with the initial outbreaks traced to contaminated food products from South American agricultural regions. Based on what we know from outbreak patterns, the infection likely began in food processing facilities where both crops and workers came into contact with mutated fungal strains. Initial symptoms were nonspecific: fever, headache, confusion, and difficulty coordinating movement. These early cases were misdiagnosed as various tropical diseases or exposure to agricultural chemicals. The infected workers were sent home or to local medical facilities, where they proceeded to attack staff and other patients in violent, uncoordinated assaults that seemed to indicate some form of acute psychosis. Within 48 hours of symptom onset, most of these initial cases had progressed to a state of total neurological compromise, their higher brain functions essentially offline while basic motor responses remained intact and hyperactive. The confusion surrounding these early cases gave the infection crucial time to spread undetected. Infected individuals in the early stages could still travel, could still interact with others before the visible symptoms became apparent. The incubation period, though short by the standards of many infectious diseases, was long enough to allow infected individuals to board buses, planes, and ships, carrying the infection to urban centres far from the initial outbreak zones. By the time public health authorities recognised they were dealing with something unprecedented, with a pathogen that had never before affected human populations, cases were already appearing in major cities across multiple continents. The mechanism of initial infection proved disturbingly simple: respiratory exposure to airborne spores. Unlike many dangerous pathogens that require direct fluid contact or vector transmission, Cordyceps could spread through the air with frightening efficiency. A single infected individual in the late stages of infection could release millions of spores into the environment with each laboured breath, contaminating entire buildings or city blocks. The spores themselves were remarkably hardy, capable of remaining viable in the environment for extended periods under a range of conditions. They could survive on surfaces, in ventilation systems, in dust that accumulated in corners and carpets. Once a space became contaminated with spores, it remained dangerous for weeks or months, creating persistent reservoirs of infection that could ambush the unwary long after the original infected individual had moved on or succumbed to the disease. Once inhaled, the spores found their way deep into lung tissue, where the warm, moist environment triggered germination. The emerging fungal structures began producing enzymes that allowed them to penetrate tissue barriers, working their way into the bloodstream and from there to every organ system in the body. But the fungus showed a marked preference for neural tissue, guided by chemical signals that drew it inexorably toward the brain and spinal cord. Within hours of successful infection, fungal filaments were crossing the blood-brain barrier and beginning their invasion of the central nervous system. The early neurological phase of infection involved a wholesale disruption of normal brain chemistry. The fungus secreted compounds that blocked the action of neurotransmitters responsible for executive function, impulse control, and conscious decision-making. The frontal cortex, that most recently evolved and distinctly human part of the brain, was particularly vulnerable to this chemical assault. As these higher functions degraded, infected individuals experienced a progressive loss of self-awareness, of the ability to plan and reason, of the recognition of other humans as beings worthy of consideration rather than obstacles or threats. This could imply that the infection was not simply destroying the brain but actively reconfiguring it, maintaining basic functions while stripping away the layers of cognition that made human behavior complex and unpredictable. At the same time, the fungus appeared to enhance certain primitive neural pathways, particularly those associated with aggression and locomotive behavior. Infected individuals showed increased activity in the amygdala and other limbic structures responsible for fear and rage responses. They also demonstrated enhanced muscular coordination for simple, repetitive movements, while losing the ability to perform complex integrated actions. This selective preservation of function suggests that the fungus was not randomly destroying neural tissue, but rather sculpting the host's behavior to serve its reproductive needs. An infected individual that remained mobile and aggressive was more likely to come into contact with uninfected hosts, creating opportunities for transmission. An infected individual that retained basic survival instincts would persist longer in the environment, providing more time for the fungal growth to mature and release spores. The speed of this transformation was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. From initial exposure to complete loss of human consciousness could occur in as little as 2 days, though variations in individual immune response meant that some hosts took longer to fully succumb. During the early hours of infection, before obvious symptoms manifested, infected individuals might appear only mildly ill, complaining of headaches or fatigue but still capable of normal social interaction. This created a perfect storm for transmission, as infected people continued their daily routines, traveling through cities, attending work or social gatherings, all while shedding spores and potentially biting or otherwise transmitting the infection through direct contact. The global medical community's initial response to the outbreak was hampered by the sheer novelty of the pathogen. Standard antifungal medications designed to combat familiar human fungal infections like candidiasis or aspergillosis proved completely ineffective against the Cordyceps strain. The genetic machinery of this fungus operated on principles that our pharmaceutical armamentarium was simply not equipped to address. Attempts to develop vaccines founded on the rapid mutation rate of the fungus and the difficulty of creating immune responses to a pathogen that spent most of its life cycle shielded within host tissue. By the time researchers began to understand the basic biology of the infection, the infrastructure needed to develop and distribute treatments at scale was already collapsing under the weight of the pandemic. The agricultural origins of the outbreak meant that initial infections clustered around food processing facilities and distribution centers. From these nodes, the infection radiated outward along the same networks that had once spread abundance: highways, rail lines, shipping routes. The global food system, that marvel of modern logistics that allowed fresh produce to travel thousands of miles from farm to table, became the vector for humanity's potential extinction. Contaminated food products carried spores into homes and restaurants. Infected workers in processing plants created massive release events that contaminated entire batches of products before anyone realized the danger. The very interconnectedness that had allowed human civilization to flourish at a global scale now ensured that no region, no matter how remote, would remain entirely safe from the spreading infection. In the rainforests where Cordyceps had evolved its sophisticated mechanisms of host manipulation, the fungus existed in balance with its environment, one species among thousands in a complex web of interaction. But released into human populations, freed from the ecological constraints that had governed its evolution, the fungus found itself in a landscape of unlimited opportunity. We had no evolutionary history with this pathogen, no immune memory to draw upon, no behavioral adaptations to avoid or resist it. We were virgin territory for a predator that had spent millions of years perfecting its hunting strategy, and we fell with stunning rapidity. The transformation from jungle pathogen to civilizational threat was complete. What had begun as a microscopic spore, carried on tropical winds or clinging to the carapace of an infected beetle, had mutated into something capable of bringing down the most complex social structures ever created. The jump from insect to human, that seemingly impossible evolutionary leap, had been achieved through a combination of agricultural pressure, environmental conditions, and genetic chance. And now, with the breach accomplished, the fungus began to spread through its new host population with the relentless efficiency that evolution had granted it, indifferent to the suffering it caused, pursuing only the ancient imperative to survive and reproduce that drives all living things. The world as humanity knew it ended not in a single catastrophic moment, but across a desperate 48-hour window in which every attempt to contain the outbreak failed in succession, each failure compounding the next until the cascading collapse became irreversible. To understand how rapidly civilization can unravel when its fundamental assumptions are violated, we must walk through those critical first 2 days, hour by hour, and witness the systematic failure of every institution that had been designed to protect us from exactly this kind of threat. Hour zero can be arbitrarily placed at the moment when public health officials in multiple countries simultaneously realized they were confronting something unprecedented. By this point, scattered cases had been occurring for perhaps 2 weeks, misdiagnosed and unconnected in the minds of the clinicians encountering them. But when epidemiologists began comparing notes, when the pattern became visible, the scope of the crisis snapped into horrifying focus. Cases were appearing in dozens of cities across multiple continents, with no clear index case or point of origin. The infection was already established within human populations, already spreading through communities before anyone had recognized it as a distinct entity requiring coordinated response. The first hours were consumed by attempts to understand what was happening. Emergency meetings were convened at hospitals, health departments, and governmental agencies. Samples from infected individuals were rushed to specialized laboratories for analysis. But the fungal nature of the pathogen meant that initial attempts to culture and identify it took longer than the bacterial or viral analyses that medical infrastructure was optimized to perform. Precious time was lost to procedural necessity, to the careful scientific process that normally serves us well, but which, in this case, allowed the infection to spread unchecked while researchers worked to characterize it. Within 12 hours of the recognition event, the first attempts at public communication began. Government officials, working with incomplete information and uncertain of the proper response, issued contradictory guidance. Some regions implemented immediate quarantine measures, cordoning off neighborhoods where cases had been identified. Others urged calm and normal activity, not wanting to trigger panic over what might still prove to be a containable outbreak. This inconsistency in messaging had profound consequences. In areas where quarantines were implemented aggressively, infected individuals attempted to flee the restrictions, spreading the disease to previously unaffected regions. In areas where authorities downplayed the threat, people continued about their daily lives, congregating in the very public spaces where transmission would be most efficient. The challenge of containing an airborne pathogen became immediately apparent. Unlike diseases that require close contact or exchange of fluids, Cordyceps could spread through simple proximity in enclosed spaces. Every subway car, every office building, every shopping centre became a potential amplification site. Contact tracing, that reliable tool of epidemiological response, proved nearly impossible when a single infected individual could have exposed hundreds or thousands of others during their contagious period. The sheer number of potential contacts overwhelmed the capacity of public health departments to investigate and monitor them all. By hour 18, hospitals in major urban areas began to experience severe stress. Emergency rooms filled with patients exhibiting the characteristic symptoms of early-stage infection, high fever, violent behavior, seeming inability to respond to verbal commands or recognize family members, healthcare workers lacking proper protective equipment and unaware of the precise transmission mechanisms became infected themselves while attempting to treat patients. This loss of medical personnel created a cascading crisis within the healthcare system. As doctors, nurses and support staff fell ill or fled, the capacity to treat not only Cordyceps cases but all other medical emergencies plummeted. People with heart attacks, strokes, injuries from accidents found themselves unable to access care. The infection wasn't just killing directly, it was dismantling the systems that kept people alive in a modern society. The military and law enforcement response, initiated around the 24-hour mark, met with only limited success. Soldiers and police officers were deployed to enforce quarantines and maintain order in areas where civil authority was breaking down. But these forces were not prepared for the nature of the threat they faced. The infected were not enemy combatants following tactical doctrine. They were relentless, mindless, and seemingly immune to the psychological deterrents that normally make shows of force effective. Warning shots, verbal commands, even non-lethal methods of crowd control had no impact on infected individuals who'd lost the capacity for fear or reason. This forced security personnel into impossible choices: either use lethal force against people who were still, in some technical sense, victims of a disease, or allow the infected to overrun defensive positions and spread the outbreak further. The psychological toll on those tasked with this impossible duty cannot be overstated. Soldiers found themselves shooting at children, at the elderly, at anyone who showed signs of infection. The normal rules of engagement, carefully constructed to minimize civilian casualties and maintain some semblance of ethical warfare, dissolved in the face of an enemy that didn't recognize surrender, that couldn't be negotiated with, that would literally climb over the bodies of its own fallen to reach new victims. Many personnel simply refused orders, unable to reconcile what they were being asked to do with their sense of morality and duty. Others followed orders but were psychologically shattered by the experience, their mental health collapsing under the weight of what they had been forced to witness and participate in. The breakdown of communication networks occurred gradually, then suddenly. In the early hours, phone lines became overwhelmed as millions of people simultaneously attempted to contact loved ones, check on family members, or seek information about the crisis. Cell networks, designed to handle typical usage patterns, couldn't cope with the unprecedented demand. Emergency services lines went unanswered as dispatchers were either infected, fled, or simply overwhelmed by the volume of calls reporting attacks, requesting medical assistance or pleading for rescue. By hour 36, large sections of urban communication infrastructure had gone dark, not from any targeted disruption, but simply from the cascading failure of systems that required constant human maintenance and oversight. Power generation and distribution began to fail around the same time. Electrical grids require continuous monitoring and adjustment to maintain stability. As workers abandoned their posts or fell victim to infection, The careful balance between generation and consumption shifted toward catastrophic instability. Automated safety systems designed to prevent equipment damage during abnormal conditions began tripping offline, isolating sections of the grid. This caused load imbalances in adjacent areas, triggering more shutdowns in a cascading pattern. Within hours, major urban centres experienced rolling blackouts that quickly became permanent outages. The loss of electrical power had immediate and devastating consequences. Hospitals lost backup generation capacity. Traffic signals went dark, creating gridlock and accidents. Water treatment plants ceased operating, leaving millions without access to clean water. Food in refrigeration units began to spoil. The fundamental services that allowed dense urban populations to exist simply stopped functioning. The failure of supply chains occurred with brutal efficiency. Modern cities maintain only a few days' worth of food and essential supplies, relying on constant deliveries to keep populations fed and provided for. The outbreak disrupted this flow immediately. Truck drivers refused to enter quarantine zones or areas reported to have infections. Distribution centres were abandoned as workers fled. Even in areas not yet directly affected by the outbreak, panic buying stripped store shelves bare within hours. The just-in-time inventory systems that had made retail so efficient in peacetime became a critical vulnerability in crisis. There was no strategic reserve to draw upon, no warehouse full of emergency supplies waiting to tide populations over until the situation stabilized. Financial systems experienced their own form of collapse. Markets, responding to the catastrophic news and the visible breakdown of order, went into free fall. Automated trading algorithms triggered by the unprecedented volatility executed massive sell orders that accelerated the decline. Governments attempted to halt trading, but by then the damage was done. The abstract wealth that existed as electronic records in databases had evaporated, taking with it the pensions, savings, and investments that represented people's plans for the future. Banks, overwhelmed by withdrawal demands and unable to access electronic clearing systems, closed their doors. The monetary system that underpinned all economic activity simply ceased to function in any meaningful sense. By our 48, governmental authority had effectively collapsed in most major urban centres. Elected officials and senior administrators had either evacuated to secure locations, become infected, or lost the ability to communicate with or command the bureaucratic apparatus they nominally controlled. Some attempted to maintain continuity of government protocols, broadcasting messages from secure bunkers or airborne command posts. But without the infrastructure to implement policy or enforce decisions, these pronouncements were effectively meaningless. Authority devolved to whoever could impose it through force: military units that had maintained cohesion, police departments that fortified their precincts, or simply armed groups of citizens who banded together for mutual protection. The speed of this collapse shocked those who had always assumed that modern civilization was robust, that our institutions and systems had sufficient redundancy to weather any crisis. But the outbreak revealed a fundamental truth. Complex systems are only as resilient as their most vulnerable components, and in a highly interconnected society, failure in any one area rapidly propagates throughout the whole structure. The electrical grid needs human operators. Those operators need food and water. Food and water need transportation systems. Transportation needs fuel distribution. Fuel distribution needs financial systems to process payments. Financial systems need electrical power and communication networks. Each dependency created a potential point of failure, and the infection hit so many points simultaneously that there was no time to adapt, no opportunity to implement contingency plans or work around the failures. Looking at the data that survived from this period, what becomes clear is that the biological infection was only one aspect of the catastrophe. The social and psychological infection that spread alongside it was equally destructive. Fear is contagious, and in the absence of reliable information, rumours and panic spread faster than the actual pathogen. People made decisions based on incomplete or false information, often choosing courses of action that increased their vulnerability rather than reducing it. Fleeing quarantine zones seemed rational to individuals but ensured the spread of infection to new areas. Hoarding supplies seemed prudent but contributed to the breakdown of distribution systems. Fighting over resources seemed necessary for survival but weakened the collective capacity to respond effectively. The tragedy of those first 48 hours is that different decisions at key moments might have altered the outcome. If the infection had been recognized even a few days earlier, before it had established itself in multiple population centers, containment might have been possible. If public health messaging had been clearer and more consistent, panic might have been reduced. If supply chains had been more resilient, if power grids had more redundancy, if communication systems had been better protected, the cascade of failures might have been interrupted at some point. But history is written by the decisions that were actually made, not by the alternatives that might have existed in some parallel timeline. And the decisions made in those critical hours, whether through ignorance, fear, or simply the overwhelming complexity of the crisis, led directly to the world we now inhabit. By the end of the second day, the future was essentially determined. The infection had spread too widely to be contained by conventional means. Critical infrastructure had been damaged or destroyed beyond rapid repair. Governmental authority had fragmented into isolated pockets of control. The global civilization that had taken millennia to construct had been reduced to scattered groups of survivors, each struggling with the immediate challenges of staying alive while the infected prowled through the ruins of everything humanity had built. The world had not ended, not quite, but it had been irreversibly transformed into something diminished, something haunted by the memory of what had been lost and the uncertainty of what might yet survive. The progression of Cordyceps brain infection follows a predictable timeline of degeneration, each stage marked by distinct physical and behavioral characteristics that reflect the advancing colonization of the host body by fungal tissue. Understanding these stages is essential, not merely for academic purposes, but for the practical matter of survival in the post-pandemic world. The infected are not a monolithic threat, but a diverse category of dangers, each stage presenting different capabilities and vulnerabilities that determine how survivors must approach encounters with them. Stage 1 infection, commonly termed the runner stage, encompasses the first hours to roughly 2 days following initial neurological compromise. Runners retain the most human characteristics of any infected category, their bodies not yet substantially altered by fungal growth, but their minds already thoroughly compromised by the chemical disruption of higher brain functions. The frontal lobe, responsible for executive function, impulse control and social cognition, has been effectively taken offline by fungal compounds that block neurotransmitter activity. What remains is a being driven by primitive hindbrain impulses, aggression, hunger, the basic survival instincts that operate below the level of conscious thought. Physically, runners appear almost normal at first glance. The fungal infection is present but not yet visible as external growth. Internal colonization is well underway, with fungal filaments spreading through the brain tissue and beginning to penetrate into the body. Cavity, but the skin remains intact and relatively unblemished, except for the site of initial infection, which may show inflammation or unusual discoloration. The eyes of runners often show distinctive signs: bloodshot sclera, dilated pupils that don't respond properly to light, and a peculiar glassiness that reflects the disruption of normal neural function. Their movements retain the full speed and coordination of the human body, making them perhaps the most immediately dangerous of all infected stages to encounter in close quarters. The behavior of runners is characterized by hyper-aggression and loss of pain sensitivity. They will attack uninfected humans on sight, driven by mechanisms that researchers theorize serve the fungus's reproductive needs by maximizing contact between infected and uninfected individuals. The aggression is not strategic or calculated, but purely reactive, triggered by the presence of potential hosts. Runners will pursue targets with single-minded determination, ignoring injuries that would incapacitate a normal human. Broken bones, lacerations, even gunshot wounds to non-vital areas fail to stop their advance. Only damage to the brainstem or catastrophic destruction of major muscle groups will reliably halt a runner's attack. The vocalizations produced by runners are among the most psychologically disturbing aspects of encountering them. They produce sounds that almost resemble human speech or screaming but distorted, as if the neural pathways for vocalization are firing randomly without the cognitive structures that would give them meaning. These sounds serve a function beyond mere intimidation. They appear to alert other infected to the presence of uninfected humans. The auditory sensitivity of all infected stages is heightened. This could imply that the fungus enhances certain sensory processing to improve the host's ability to locate and pursue prey. The screams of a runner encountering a human can draw other infected from significant distances, turning a single encounter into a swarm situation within minutes. The transition from runner to stage 2, the stalker phase, occurs over a period of weeks to several months, depending on individual variations in immune response and environmental factors. Stalkers represent infected who have survived long enough for the fungal colonization to advance significantly, while the host body remains relatively intact and mobile. The most distinctive feature of stalkers is the emergence of fungal plates beginning to break through the skin, particularly around the face and upper body. These plates, formed from densely packed fungal tissue, are hard and provide some protection against physical trauma, but they also begin to restrict the infected individual's range of motion and sensory capabilities. The behavioral pattern of stalkers differs markedly from runners. Where runners attack with mindless aggression, stalkers exhibit something that resembles cunning, though it's more accurate to describe it as instinctive predatory behavior rather than genuine intelligence. Stalkers will hide in shadowed areas, behind obstacles, in spaces where they can ambush passing humans. They move more quietly than runners, their footfalls more cautious, their vocalizations reduced to occasional clicking sounds that may serve as echolocation precursors or communication with other infected. This stealth behavior could imply that as the infection progresses and the host body begins to degrade, the fungus adjusts its behavioral programming to compensate for reduced physical capabilities by emphasizing surprise over direct confrontation. The fungal plates that characterize stalkers are not merely cosmetic changes, but represent a fundamental restructuring of the host's physiology. The fungus is replacing human tissue with its own structures, creating a hybrid organism that is no longer entirely human, but not yet completely transformed into a fungal reproductive structure. These plates appear first on the face because the brain, with its rich blood supply and nutrient density, is the primary site of fungal growth. As the fungus consumes and replaces brain tissue, it grows outward, eventually breaking through the skull and skin. The infected individual in this stage is likely experiencing significant sensory degradation. Vision becomes impaired as fungal growth encroaches on optical nerves and structures. Hearing may remain relatively intact, possibly even enhanced, but the processing of auditory information is purely reflexive. Stage 3, the clicker phase, represents infected individuals who have survived a year or more post-infection. By this point, the fungal colonization is nearly complete. The characteristic feature of clickers is the total calcification and fungal overgrowth of the head and face. The skull has essentially been broken apart from within by expanding fungal plates, creating a grotesque crown of hardened fungal tissue that completely obscures the original human features. The eyes are non-functional, covered or destroyed by fungal growth. The infected individual is now completely blind in any conventional sense. To compensate for the loss of vision, clickers have developed a sophisticated form of echolocation. They produce rapid clicking sounds by forcing air through vocal structures that have been modified by fungal growth. These clicks bounce off surfaces in the environment, and the infected individual processes the returning sound waves to construct a mental map of their surroundings. The auditory processing centers of the brain, relatively preserved because they remain useful to the fungus's survival strategy, allow clickers to navigate complex environments and detect the presence of prey with disturbing accuracy. In complete darkness, where human survivors are effectively helpless, clickers hunt with terrifying efficiency. The physical strength of clickers exceeds that of earlier stages, possibly because the fungal tissue provides structural reinforcement to the deteriorating body. The hardened plates act as armor, making clickers extremely difficult to kill with anything less than high-caliber firearms or explosives. Hand-to-hand combat with a clicker is effectively suicidal. Their strength combined with their armored exterior and relentless aggression make them nearly unstoppable in close quarters. The fungal plates on their heads can withstand impacts that would shatter human bone, and the loss of pain sensation means they will continue attacking until physically incapable of doing so. The behavioral repertoire of clickers is more limited than earlier stages, but no less dangerous. They patrol areas where they have established themselves, moving through spaces with a lurching, somewhat uncoordinated gait that reflects the extensive damage to their motor control systems. When they detect prey through echolocation, they enter a frenzied state, charging toward the source of sound with surprising speed. Their attacks are characterized by overwhelming physical violence, using their enhanced strength to tear at victims, or, if they manage to grasp someone, to bite with powerful jaw muscles that can easily penetrate clothing and flesh. These bites serve the dual purpose of killing the victim and ensuring fungal transmission through the introduction of spores and fungal tissue directly into the bloodstream. The lifespan of a clicker is uncertain, but evidence suggests they can persist for years in this state, serving as long-term reservoirs of infection. They require minimal sustenance, the fungal colonization having reduced their metabolic needs to a fraction of what a healthy human requires. They congregate in dark, damp environments where fungal spore colonies can flourish. Basements, tunnels, abandoned buildings with collapsed sections that exclude light and retain moisture. These congregations create zones of intense biological hazard, areas so thick with spores that even brief exposure without respiratory protection guarantees infection. Stage 4 represents the terminal evolution of the infection, though terminal is perhaps a misnomer since infected individuals can persist in this state indefinitely under the right conditions. The two most commonly documented Stage 4 variations are bloaters and shamblers, each representing different environmental adaptations of the fungal colonization process. Bloaters are perhaps the most visually horrifying of all infected types. They are massive, their bodies swollen to grotesque proportions by the accumulation of fungal plates and spore-producing structures. A bloater may have been infected for a decade or more, the fungus having had time to completely transform the host body into something that barely resembles human form. The skin, where it remains visible between fungal plates, is pallid and stretched tight over the distended mass beneath. The entire surface of a bloater is covered in thick, layered fungal armor that makes them nearly impervious to conventional weapons. Even high-powered rifle rounds may fail to penetrate deeply enough to cause significant damage. The behavior of bloaters is slow and deliberate. The massive bulk of fungal growth has made rapid movement impossible, but what they lack in speed they compensate for with devastating offensive capabilities. Bloaters pull chunks of fungal tissue from their own bodies and hurl these masses at threats. Upon impact, these projectiles burst, releasing clouds of infectious spores and mycotoxins that can incapacitate or kill even without direct infection. Based on what we know about fungal reproduction, we can assume these projectiles represent a kind of active spore dispersal mechanism. The fungus, using the host's remaining motor capabilities to spread itself across greater distances than passive release would allow. Close combat with a bloater is among the most dangerous encounters possible in the post-pandemic world. Their strength is immense, capable of tearing a human body apart with their bare hands. The fungal armor provides protection not just from weapons, but from environmental hazards, allowing bloaters to wade through fire or toxic environments that would kill other infected stages. The spore clouds they constantly emit create a zone of infection around them, making even proximity without proper protection potentially fatal. Survivors who've encountered bloaters and lived universally report the experience as nightmarish, describing creatures that should not be able to move or function, yet continue to hunt with implacable persistence. Shamblers represent a different evolutionary path, adapted to wet environments and characterized by the generation of caustic, acidic compounds. These infected appear in regions with high humidity or standing water, their fungal colonization having evolved to thrive in aquatic conditions. The fungus covering their bodies produces a corrosive substance that drips constantly from their forms, leaving trails of chemical burn wherever they move. This acid serves both offensive and defensive purposes, damaging anyone who comes into physical contact while also breaking down organic matter in the environment, possibly to create nutrient sources for fungal growth. When threatened, shamblers actively spray this acidic compound, creating barriers of caustic mist that deny access to areas and inflict severe chemical burns on anyone caught within. The range and volume of acid a shambler can produce suggests extensive internal modification, the fungus having transformed major portions of the body cavity into chemical production facilities. This could imply an even more sophisticated level of biological engineering than seen in other infected stages, the fungus actively synthesizing complex compounds rather than merely restructuring existing biological systems. These rare terminal mutations represent the outer edge of what the Cordyceps infection can achieve given sufficient time and appropriate environmental conditions. They serve as horrifying examples of how completely the fungus can transform human biology, creating organisms that serve its reproductive needs with ruthless efficiency. The existence of these forms also suggests that the infection is still evolving, still exploring new strategies for survival and dispersal. Each bloater or shambler represents years of sustained fungal growth and adaptation, a living laboratory of mycological innovation that has had ample time to refine its approach to host manipulation and environmental exploitation. The progression from initial infection to these terminal forms represents a complete biological arc, from the moment a spore finds purchase in human lung tissue to the eventual transformation of the entire organism into a fungal reproduction platform. At each stage, the infected serve the fungus's evolutionary imperatives. Early stages maximize transmission through aggressive behavior, middle stages balance mobility with durability, and late stages focus on spore production and long-term survival. The human being that once inhabited the body is gone long before the terminal stages are reached, their consciousness consumed along with the brain tissue that sustained it. What remains is a monument to the fungus's terrible efficiency, a warning written in flesh and fungal tissue about the consequences of humanity's vulnerability to forces we cannot control or predict. In the immediate aftermath of the outbreak's first wave, as cities burned and the infected roamed freely through streets that had once teemed with ordered human activity, the remnants of governmental authority faced an impossible mandate: restore order, protect survivors, and somehow contain or reverse the catastrophe. The organization that emerged to fulfill this mandate was not born from careful planning or democratic deliberation, but from the desperate improvisation of a collapsing state. The Federal Disaster Response Agency, FEDRA, began as a temporary coordination body designed to manage the crisis response. It would end as the permanent military government of the few remaining secure zones, a transformation that reveals much about how quickly democratic principles can be abandoned when survival itself is at stake. FEDRA's origins lie in pre-pandemic disaster management frameworks. When the outbreak began, existing agencies like FEMA attempted to coordinate response using established protocols for natural disasters or terrorist attacks. But the scale and nature of the Cordyceps pandemic overwhelmed these frameworks within days. Traditional disaster response assumes that affected areas can be isolated while resources flow in from unaffected regions. The pandemic affected everywhere simultaneously. It assumes that victims are passive recipients of aid rather than active vectors of further destruction. The infected were anything but passive. Most critically, standard disaster management assumes that the disaster itself is time-limited, that once the hurricane passes or the earthquake ends, reconstruction can begin. The Cordyceps outbreak never ended. It persisted, evolved, and continued to threaten every attempt at stabilization. The transition from FEMA to FEDRA marked the moment when civilian government agencies acknowledged they could not handle the crisis through normal channels and ceded authority to military command structures. This happened gradually across different regions as local civilian administrators either died, fled, or simply admitted they lacked the resources and expertise to impose order on chaos. Military commanders, accustomed to hierarchical organization and empowered to use force without the legal constraints that normally governed civilian law enforcement, stepped into the vacuum. What emerged was not a coherent national government, but a patchwork of military districts, each commanded by whoever held the highest surviving rank or could marshal the most armed force. The establishment of quarantine zones represented FEDRA's primary strategy for managing the post-outbreak world. The logic was straightforward: consolidate survivors in defendable areas, establish perimeters that could be monitored and protected against infected incursion, and use these secure zones as bases from which to gradually reclaim territory and resources. Major cities that still had functioning military installations became the natural sites for these zones. The walls went up quickly, constructed from whatever materials were available: concrete barriers, shipping containers, military fortifications. The criteria for what made a good quarantine zone had little to do with quality of life and everything to do with defensibility. Access points were minimized and heavily fortified. Sight lines were cleared to allow guards to identify approaching infected. Everything was subordinated to the single goal of keeping the infected out and the uninfected in. Life within the quarantine zones quickly settled into a grim routine that bore little resemblance to pre-pandemic society. The fundamental organizing principle was control. FEDRA administered every aspect of existence within the walls: food, distribution, work assignments, housing allocation, movement between sections. Individual liberty, that cornerstone of the democratic societies most quarantine zone inhabitants had grown up in, became a luxury the New World could not afford. Curfews were absolute. Gatherings of more than a few people were forbidden unless authorized. Expression of dissent was treated as a threat to collective security and suppressed with immediate force. The rationale for this authoritarian structure was not entirely without merit. The quarantine zones existed in a state of permanent siege, their populations crammed into spaces too small for comfortable habitation, their resources perpetually inadequate to meet everyone's needs. In such conditions, FEDRA argued, democracy was unworkable. Debate took time, and time allowed problems to fester into crises. Consensus building required trust, and trust was in desperately short supply among traumatized survivors who had watched civilization collapse. Majority rule could lead to the tyranny of the many over the few, potentially forcing vulnerable populations out of the zones entirely. Better, in FEDRA's calculation, to have clear hierarchies, unambiguous rules, and the certainty that orders would be followed without question or delay. But the human cost of this approach was staggering. FEDRA's governance relied on fear and violence to maintain compliance. Public executions were common, used both to punish rule breakers and to send messages about the consequences of defiance. The charges could be anything from theft of ration cards to attempting to leave the zone without authorization to suspected collaboration with resistance groups. The trials, if they occurred at all, were perfunctory, lasting minutes rather than hours, with no meaningful opportunity for defense or appeal. The executions themselves were carried out in public spaces where residents could be forced to watch, a deliberate strategy of intimidation designed to crush any thoughts of resistance before they could organize into action. The ration system embodied everything cruel and arbitrary about FEDRA's rule. Food, medicine, clothing, all the necessities of survival were distributed through tightly controlled channels. Residents received ration cards that entitled them to fixed amounts based on their work assignments and perceived value to the zone's functioning. Those who worked in essential services, soldiers, technicians who maintained infrastructure, received adequate if not generous rations. Those assigned to manual labor, cleaning or other tasks FEDRA considered less critical received barely enough to survive. The elderly, the disabled, anyone who could not perform productive labor found themselves at the bottom of the hierarchy. Their rations cut to starvation levels in what amounted to a slow policy of elimination. This brutal calculus reflected FEDRA's fundamental philosophy. The quarantine zones existed to preserve humanity as an abstract category, not to ensure the welfare of every individual human within them. If some had to die so that others could live, if resources had to be concentrated among the productive at the expense of the vulnerable, these were acceptable costs in the larger struggle for species survival. The moral weight of these decisions appeared to rest lightly on FEDRA's leadership, who framed their policies as pragmatic necessities rather than moral choices. There was no room for sentiment in their calculus, no space for the values of compassion or equity that had once animated debates about social justice. There was only the cold arithmetic of survival, calories consumed versus calories produced, useful labour versus useless mouths, security versus freedom. The corruption that inevitably accompanied such concentrated power added an additional layer of cruelty to life under FEDRA rule. While official policy distributed resources according to the rigid ration system, unofficial policies allowed those with connections or contraband to obtain extra food, medicine, or privileges. FEDRA officers, already empowered by their monopoly on legitimate violence, used their positions to extract additional benefits from desperate residents. Protection rackets operated openly within the zones, with soldiers demanding payments to overlook violations or to guarantee that ration cards would be honoured rather than arbitrarily confiscated. Sexual exploitation was widespread, with vulnerable residents forced to submit to FEDRA personnel in exchange for necessities or simply to avoid being labelled troublemakers and subjected to heightened scrutiny. The smuggling economy that flourished in the gaps and margins of FEDRA's control represented one form of resistance to this oppression. Smugglers moved goods between zones, connected buyers and sellers, and provided access to items that official channels restricted or monopolized. Some smugglers operated out of pure profit motive, indifferent to the moral dimensions of their trade. Others saw themselves as providing essential services that FEDRA's incompetence or cruelty made necessary. The smuggling networks required cooperation from certain FEDRA personnel, creating a web of complicity that further undermined whatever legitimacy the military government might have claimed. Guards took bribes to allow contraband through checkpoints. Officers provided intelligence about patrol schedules or inspection protocols. Even high-ranking FEDRA administrators participated in the black market, accumulating personal wealth and luxury items while enforcing austerity on the general population. Over time, FEDRA's quarantine zones became less like temporary emergency measures and more like permanent states of exception, zones where normal legal and ethical standards had been suspended indefinitely. Children born within the walls grew up knowing nothing but military rule, ration lines, and the constant threat of punishment for infractions they might not even understand. Education, when it existed at all, focused on practical skills and indoctrination in FEDRA's ideology of security through submission. The history of the pre-pandemic world, the democratic traditions and civil liberties that had once defined the societies these zones had been carved from, faded into myth and memory, relegated to the stories of the old people who remembered but could do nothing to restore. The question of whether FEDRA's approach was necessary, whether there existed alternative paths that might have preserved more of human dignity and freedom while still ensuring survival, is one that haunts analysis of this period. Defenders of FEDRA argue that the military government, for all its flaws, did preserve human life in numbers that would not have survived without centralized control and resource allocation. Critics counter that the cost in human suffering and moral degradation was too high, that alternative models of community organization based on cooperation rather than coercion might have been equally effective and far less brutal. The truth is that we cannot know what alternatives might have succeeded because they were never attempted at scale. FEDRA's model became dominant not because it was proven superior, but because it was imposed by those who had the guns and the will to use them. If FEDRA represented the impulse toward authoritarian control in the face of catastrophe, the Fireflies embodied the opposite impulse, the refusal to accept that survival required the abandonment of democratic principles and human rights. The organization that would become known as the Fireflies coalesced in the months following the establishment of the quarantine zones, drawing together former activists, academics, medical professionals, and ordinary citizens who had watched the military takeover with growing alarm. Their founding ideology was simple. FEDRA's rule was illegitimate. The quarantine zones were prisons rather than sanctuaries, and the only moral response was resistance. The early Fireflies organised covertly within the zones, spreading messages of resistance through graffiti, pamphlets, and whispered conversations in spaces where FEDRA surveillance was less intense. Their symbol, a stylized firefly rendered in spray paint on walls and buildings, became a sign of hope for some and a mark of dangerous sedition for FEDRA authorities. The choice of symbol was deliberate. Fireflies produce light in darkness, brief flashes that guide others and signal presence without revealing precise location. The metaphor captured the organization's vision of themselves as beacons of resistance in a world that FEDRA was trying to darken with fear and control. The Fireflies' initial actions focused on undermining FEDRA's legitimacy and demonstrating that alternative forms of organization were possible. They established underground networks to distribute food and medicine to those whom FEDRA had deemed unproductive and therefore unworthy of adequate rations. They helped smuggle people out of zones where conditions were particularly brutal, connecting refugees with safer areas or independent settlements beyond FEDRA control. They disseminated information that FEDRA tried to suppress, news from other zones, evidence of corruption among military administrators, accounts of atrocities committed in the name of security. In these early days, the Fireflies genuinely operated as a liberation movement, their violence limited to self-defense and carefully targeted actions against FEDRA infrastructure rather than personnel. But the nature of armed resistance creates its own logic, and over time the Fireflies evolved from a movement focused on liberation into something more desperate and violent. FEDRA's response to early Firefly actions was brutally effective. Suspected members were arrested, tortured for information about cell structures and supply networks, and executed publicly to deter others from joining the cause. Informants were recruited or coerced, creating an atmosphere of paranoia within resistance circles where trust became impossible. The Fireflies who survived these purges were often those willing to adopt FEDRA's tactics against their enemies. Ambushes that killed soldiers who might have been sympathetic to their cause along with those who were not. Bombings that caused collateral damage among the very civilians they claimed to protect. Summary executions of collaborators without trial or due process. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. Each Firefly killed by FEDRA radicalized those who remained. Each failed action that cost lives created pressure to escalate, to hit harder, to make FEDRA pay a price too high to ignore. The organization fractured into semi-autonomous cells with varying levels of commitment to the original ideals and varying willingness to embrace terrorist tactics. Some cells maintained strict codes of conduct, refusing to harm civilians and attempting to minimize casualties even among FEDRA personnel. Others adopted a philosophy of total war, arguing that anyone who supported FEDRA through their compliance or inaction was a legitimate target, that the liberation of the zones justified any means necessary. The quest for a cure became the Fireflies' defining mission, and ultimately their obsession. From the early days of the outbreak, the dream of finding a vaccine or treatment that could immunize people against Cordyceps infection or reverse its effects in the early stages had animated medical research within the zones. But FEDRA controlled most of the resources and facilities necessary for such research, and their priorities focused on containment and control rather than cure. The Fireflies, particularly those cells that included surviving doctors and scientists, committed themselves to finding what FEDRA would not or could not, a way to defeat the infection biologically, rather than simply holding it at bay with walls and bullets. This mission led the Fireflies down increasingly desperate paths. They sought out research facilities, military hospitals, university laboratories, anywhere that might contain useful data or equipment. These expeditions into infected territory were extraordinarily dangerous, combining all the hazards of navigating zones controlled by the infected, with the additional risk of FEDRA patrols that shot resistance members on sight. The Fireflies who specialized in these operations became hardened, survivors, skilled at moving through ruined cities, avoiding both infected and military, retrieving whatever scraps of scientific knowledge remained accessible in the ruins of the pre-pandemic world. The human cost of the cure research was staggering and morally complex. Finding a vaccine required test subjects, infected individuals in various stages to study the progression of the disease, and uninfected volunteers to test potential treatments. The ethics of such research would have been fraught even under ideal circumstances with full informed consent and institutional review boards overseeing every protocol. In the post-pandemic world, with resources scarce and FEDRA hunting the researchers, ethical niceties became impossible to maintain. Based on what we know about the Fireflies' operations, we can assume that not all their test subjects volunteered freely, that some may have been coerced or even abducted for experimentation. The organization that had started with high-minded ideals about human dignity found itself contemplating sacrificing individuals, possibly against their will, for the chance of saving humanity as a whole. The ideological debates within the Fireflies about these questions consumed enormous energy and ultimately contributed to the organization's fragmentation. Some members argued that the discovery of a cure would justify any actions taken to achieve it, that the moral calculus was simple: a few lives sacrificed now versus billions of lives potentially saved if the infection could be stopped. Others maintained that abandoning ethical constraints would make the Fireflies no better than FEDRA, that the means used to achieve liberation determined the character of whatever society might emerge from that liberation. These were not abstract philosophical discussions, but urgent practical debates with immediate consequences for what actions the organization would take, and what lines it would or would not cross. The relationship between the Fireflies and the broader population of the quarantine zones was complicated and evolved over time. Initially, many residents sympathized with the Fireflies' goals, even if they feared the consequences of open support. FEDRA's brutality created natural allies for any resistance movement, and the Fireflies' early focus on mutual aid and information sharing won them genuine popular support. But as the conflict escalated and Firefly actions led to FEDRA crackdowns that affected everyone in the zones, sympathy began to erode. Residents caught between two armed factions, neither of which could guarantee their safety, often came to resent the Fireflies as much as they resented FEDRA. The revolution the Fireflies promised seemed increasingly distant and hypothetical compared to the immediate suffering their actions provoked. By the time the Fireflies were largely defeated or scattered in most zones, they had become something very different from their founding vision. The organization had evolved from idealistic resistance into violent insurgency, from liberation movement into terrorist cell, from hope for democratic restoration into desperate gamblers willing to stake everything on the slim chance of finding a cure. Whether this transformation was inevitable given the circumstances, whether any resistance movement could have maintained moral purity while fighting an enemy as ruthless as FEDRA in conditions as desperate as the quarantine zones, remains an open question. What is clear is that the cost of the Firefly struggle was paid not just by the fighters themselves, but by countless civilians caught in the crossfire, by the social trust destroyed by the constant suspicion and betrayal the conflict engendered, and ultimately by the failure to achieve either of their primary goals, the overthrow of FEDRA or the discovery of a cure. The Fireflies' legacy in the post-pandemic world is ambiguous. To some, they represent humanity's refusal to surrender to tyranny, the spark of resistance that proved authoritarian control was not inevitable even in the darkest circumstances. To others, they exemplify the dangers of revolutionary idealism, untempered by practical considerations of what is achievable and what costs are acceptable. Their symbol remains visible in the ruins, that painted firefly on crumbling walls, serving as a reminder that people once fought for something beyond mere survival, that the hope for a better world persisted even when that world seemed irretrievably lost. Whether that memory inspires or haunts those who see it depends on their own experiences and beliefs about what resistance means and what it can achieve. While human factions fought over the ruins of civilization, nature began the patient work of reclaiming territory that had been held for centuries under human control. The absence of maintenance, the cessation of the constant labor required to keep natural processes at bay, allowed the vegetative world to return with astonishing speed. Within months of the outbreak, grass pushed through cracks in pavement. Within years, trees sprouted in the accumulated debris of abandoned buildings. Within a decade, entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath canopies of growth that transformed urban landscapes into something approaching primordial forest. This ecological succession followed predictable patterns observed wherever human activity ceases. Pioneer species, those plants adapted to quickly colonize disturbed ground, established themselves first. Grasses, shrubs, fast-growing trees like birch and poplar. These initial colonizers created conditions that allowed more complex plant communities to follow. Their fallen leaves built up layers of organic matter, enriching soil that had been compacted and depleted by urban use. Their roots broke up pavement and building foundations, creating openings for larger plants to take hold. Birds and small mammals, returning to spaces humans had vacated, carried seeds that sprouted into gardens wilder and more diverse than any human had designed. The transformation of urban environments into ecosystems dominated by vegetation created visual tableaux that are simultaneously beautiful and melancholy. Skyscrapers became vertical gardens, their facades covered in climbing vines, their shattered windows revealing interiors choked with plant growth. Highways transformed into linear meadows, the concrete barely visible beneath grass and wildflowers that attracted insects and the birds that fed on them. City parks, once carefully maintained expressions of controlled nature, exploded into unmanaged tangles of growth, where the original design could barely be discerned beneath the new order nature imposed. The silence of these spaces, absent the mechanical sounds of human activity, was broken only by wind through leaves, bird calls, and the occasional movement of deer or other animals returning to territories their ancestors had fled centuries before. Water played a crucial role in this transformation. Without functioning drainage systems, rainwater accumulated in low-lying areas, creating ponds and marshes where none had existed. These wetlands became magnets for aquatic life, frogs, insects, waterfowl. They also created perfect conditions for the Cordyceps fungus to flourish. The combination of standing water, darkness, and organic matter provided ideal environments for spore production. Basements, subway tunnels, any underground space where water could accumulate, became fungal strongholds, chambers thick with spore clouds so dense they created visible mist in flashlight beams. The chemistry of these spore clouds represents one of the most persistent environmental hazards of the post-pandemic world. Cordyceps spores are remarkably stable, capable of remaining viable for extended periods even in hostile conditions. They resist desiccation, can survive freeze-thaw cycles, and maintain infectivity across a wide temperature range. Once a space becomes contaminated with spores, it remains dangerous essentially indefinitely without active remediation. The spores settle on every surface, accumulate in dust and debris, become airborne again with any disturbance. Areas of heavy spore concentration cannot be safely entered without respiratory protection, and even with gas masks, the risk of infection through eye contact or skin absorption of spores means that exposure must be minimized. The infected themselves contribute to this environmental hazard through their role as mobile spore dispersal mechanisms. Every breath an infected individual takes releases spores. Every movement sheds fungal material. The spaces where infected congregate become saturated with spores, creating zones of contamination that extend far beyond the immediate presence of the infected. Buildings that house large numbers of infected, particularly those that sheltered clickers or more advanced stages, remain dangerous years after the infected have moved on or been eliminated. The spores persist, waiting for new hosts to stumble into their silent embrace. Long-term environmental impacts of the infection extend beyond simple spore contamination. Infected corpses, when they finally cease functioning and collapse, do not decompose in the normal manner. The fungal colonization continues post-mortem, the organism treating the dead host as a substrate for fruiting body development. These fruiting bodies produce massive spore releases, single events that can contaminate entire city blocks. The corpse itself becomes a fungal garden, covered in the characteristic stalks and caps, that release spores in response to disturbance or simply when mature. Areas where many infected died during the initial outbreak or subsequent years became permanent contamination zones, fields of fungal growth where human remains are barely visible beneath the colonizing organism. This could imply that the Cordyceps infection has achieved something unprecedented in the relationship between pathogen and host. It has effectively integrated itself into the ecosystem as a permanent feature rather than a temporary disease outbreak. The fungus has established sustainable colonies throughout the former urban centers of human civilization. It has mobile vectors in the infected that continue to spread spores and attack uninfected humans who might otherwise recolonize cleared areas. It has environmental reservoirs in contaminated buildings and underground spaces that serve as perpetual sources of new infections. The combination of these factors means that the infection is not something that will fade with time, that will burn itself out through lack of hosts or environmental changes. It is a permanent alteration of the biosphere, a new parameter that any future human society will have to accommodate and navigate. Yet within this landscape of biological hazard there exists strange beauty. The overgrown ruins, the buildings slowly collapsing as their structures are undermined by root systems and weathering, create vistas that are undeniably striking. Sunlight filtering through broken roofs onto carpets of moss, the play of light and shadow on vine-covered walls, the unexpected splash of colour from wildflowers growing in what was once a commercial district. All these moments provide aesthetic experiences that are profound precisely because they are so divorced from human intention. Nature has no interest in beauty for its own sake. These scenes are side effects of ecological processes that care nothing for human observers. But for those observers who navigate these spaces, the beauty is real and meaningful, a reminder that the world contains wonders that exist independent of human purpose. The return of wildlife to urban spaces represents another dimension of nature's reclamation. With humans largely absent and the hunting pressure that had driven many species to near extinction eliminated, animal populations rebounded. Deer, once confined to rural areas and protected parks, now roam freely through city streets. Predators that had been extirpated from regions centuries ago have begun to return, following the prey populations that sustain them. The infected, despite their aggression toward humans, seem to provoke little interest from most animal species. This could imply that the fungal infection produces chemical signals that animals recognize as marking the host as inedible or dangerous to approach. The interactions between the ecological succession and the human survivors attempting to rebuild create zones of contested territory. Settlements require cleared land for agriculture, construction materials harvested from ruins, and access to resources scattered throughout overgrown urban areas. But pushing back against nature's reclamation requires constant effort. Gardens must be protected from deer and other herbivores. Fields must be cleared of the vegetation that immediately attempts to recolonize any disturbed ground. Buildings must be maintained against the infiltration of roots and moisture that will undermine structural integrity. The struggle is unending, and in many cases the survivors lack the energy and resources to maintain the cleared zones they need. Settlements contract, abandoning outer sections that become too difficult to defend against both the infected and the encroaching vegetation. The moss-covered monuments that remain in these spaces serve as markers of what was lost. Statues in town squares, plaques commemorating historical events, architectural flourishes on building facades that someone once thought would inspire or instruct future generations, all now slowly disappearing beneath biological growth. These artifacts have lost their original meaning. The cultural context that made them significant erased along with the civilization that produced them. Yet they persist as physical objects, tangible connections to a past that becomes more mythological with each passing year. Children born in the post-pandemic world will grow up seeing these monuments as features of the natural landscape, no more remarkable than oddly shaped boulders or ancient trees. The human history inscribed in stone and metal will become indecipherable, another layer of mystery in ruins that have ceased to speak any language the living understand. The question of whether humanity can reverse this reclamation, whether it is possible or even desirable to push back nature and rebuild something approaching the pre-pandemic level of human control over the environment, divides the survivors who think about such things. Some maintain that the goal must be to reclaim what was lost, to clear the vegetation, eliminate the infected, decontaminate the spore zones, and rebuild civilization in its former glory. Others argue that the pandemic revealed the hubris of that previous civilization, that the attempt to dominate nature completely was always doomed to failure, and that any sustainable future must involve accommodation with the natural world rather than conquest of it. These debates are largely theoretical given the immediate challenges of survival, but they reflect deeper questions about what it means to be human in a world that no longer recognizes human exceptionalism, that treats our cities and monuments as just another substrate for ecological processes that operate on timescales far longer than individual human lives or even the lifespans of entire civilizations. In the spaces between the contaminated zones and the fortified settlements, in the gaps and margins where neither FEDRA's control nor the infected's dominance is absolute, life continues in forms that would have been unrecognizable to the pre-pandemic world. These are the spaces of the true survivors, those who have neither the protection of walls and ration cards nor the terminal fate of infection, but who instead navigate the constant uncertainty of existence in a world that has become fundamentally hostile to human flourishing. Their lives provide insight into what remains of humanity when the structures that once defined civilization have collapsed. The communities that have emerged outside FEDRA's control vary widely in size, organization, and philosophy, but they share certain characteristics born of necessity. Self-sufficiency is paramount. Without access to supply chains or specialized labor, these settlements must provide for all their own needs: food production through agriculture and hunting, water purification, shelter construction and maintenance, defense against both infected and human threats, medical care with whatever limited resources and knowledge remain available. This requirement for comprehensive self-reliance means that settlements tend to remain small, numbering in the dozens or low hundreds rather than the thousands that might have congregated in a single pre-pandemic neighborhood. The shift from global communication to isolated pockets represents one of the most profound transformations of the post-pandemic world. In the years before the outbreak, humanity existed in a state of unprecedented interconnection. Information traveled instantaneously across continents. Events in one nation immediately affected markets and policies in others. Cultural exchange happened at a pace and scale that would have been incomprehensible to previous generations. This global network created efficiencies and possibilities that shaped every aspect of modern life, but it also created vulnerabilities that the pandemic exploited. When the networks failed, when the electrical grids and communication systems went dark, humanity fragmented into isolated groups that lost contact with each other within days or weeks. The psychological impact of this isolation cannot be overstated. Human beings are social creatures who derive meaning and identity from their connections to larger communities. The knowledge that millions or billions of others share your language, culture, and concerns provides a sense of participation in something greater than individual existence. When that knowledge disappears, when you can no longer be certain that anyone exists beyond the immediate horizon of your experience, a profound existential loneliness sets in. The survivors of the pandemic's first years experienced this dislocation acutely. They had memories of a connected world, could recall the experience of communication with distant others, and felt the loss deeply. But the children born after the collapse, those who have no memory of global civilization, experience the isolation differently. For them, the world has always been small, bounded by the territory their community controls and the rumors that occasionally arrive from traveling merchants or refugees from fallen settlements. These children represent the first generation of post-pandemic humanity, and their psychological development occurs under conditions that would have been considered severe deprivation in the world before. They grow up surrounded by constant reminders of mortality and danger. The infected are not abstract threats, but regular presence at the edges of settlement territory, requiring vigilance and preparation from childhood. The masks and filters needed to safely navigate many areas become as familiar as any article of clothing. The sounds of gunfire or the screams of infected are part of the ambient soundscape, no more remarkable than traffic noise would have been to their grandparents. Death is not hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes, but visible and immediate, whether from infection, violence, starvation, or the countless accidents and illnesses that claim lives when advanced medical care is unavailable. Yet, these children also demonstrate remarkable resilience and adaptation. Human beings are extraordinarily flexible in what they can accept as normal. The post-pandemic childhood, for all its deprivations and dangers, still contains moments of play, friendship, learning, joy. Children find ways to be children even in the ruins. They play games, tell stories, form friendships and rivalries, experience wonder at the world they discover. Their laughter when it occurs is not diminished by the circumstances that surround it. If anything, those moments of genuine childhood happiness take on enhanced significance, representing defiant assertions that life contains value even when stripped of comfort and security. The agrarian self-reliance that defines most surviving settlements represents a return to patterns of human organization that predate the Industrial Revolution by millennia. Agriculture becomes the primary occupation of the majority of community members. Knowledge of planting, harvest, food preservation, and animal husbandry becomes more valuable than most of the specialized skills that commanded high salaries in the pre-pandemic economy. The rhythm of life aligns with seasons and weather rather than quarterly earnings reports or project deadlines. This transformation is not romantic or idyllic. Agricultural labor is difficult, and the margin between successful harvest and starvation remains thin. But it provides a structure for existence, a clear relationship between effort and survival that was often obscured in the complex economies of the past. Trade networks between settlements, while vastly reduced from pre-pandemic scale, still exist and serve crucial functions. Communities produce surpluses of some goods while lacking others, creating opportunities for exchange. Salt, ammunition, preserved food, medicine, tools, seeds, all these move along routes that connect settlements despite the dangers of travel. The merchants and traders who facilitate this exchange are among the most important members of post-pandemic society. They risk their lives traveling between communities, navigating infected territory, and avoiding hostile groups to maintain the threads of connection that prevent complete isolation. They also serve as carriers of information, spreading news, warnings about threats, and occasional messages between separated families or friends. The social structures that emerge in these communities often reflect pre-pandemic norms to some degree, but modified by current necessities. Many settlements maintain some form of democratic decision-making, recognizing that cooperation as buy-in from community members is essential for survival. Others adopt more hierarchical structures, with leaders whose authority derives from their success in keeping the community alive rather than from electoral processes. Gender roles, racial divisions, and other social categorizations that shaped pre-pandemic society persist in some communities and are rejected or reformed in others. The pandemic did not erase the cultural legacy of humanity's past, but it did create opportunities for communities to consciously choose which traditions to maintain and which to abandon. The question of law and justice in these communities reveals the challenges of maintaining social order without the institutions that enforced it in the past. There are no prisons in most settlements. The resources required to confine and feed someone who is not contributing labor cannot be justified. Punishment for serious crimes often means exile, effectively a death sentence given the dangers outside settlement walls, or execution for offences that threaten community survival. The harshness of this justice troubles some community members, particularly those who remember when due process and proportional punishment were considered fundamental rights. But the alternatives seem worse, allowing destructive behaviour to continue unchecked, or diverting scarce resources to maintain something resembling the prison systems of the past. The result is a rough justice that prioritises community survival over individual rights, accepting tragic outcomes as necessary costs of collective security. The psychological toll of this existence accumulates across years and generations. Depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress are nearly universal among survivors of the initial outbreak who witnessed the collapse of civilization and lost most of those they loved. These individuals carry trauma that manifests in nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and difficulty forming new attachments when any relationship might be violently terminated at any moment. The younger generation, those born into the pandemic world, display different psychological patterns. They lack the trauma of witnessing the collapse, but they carry the weight of growing up in constant danger, of never experiencing the security and abundance that their parents or grandparents might describe in stories that sound increasingly like fairy tales. Mental health care in the post-pandemic world is primitive by pre-outbreak standards. There are no pharmaceutical treatments for anxiety or depression. The factories that produce such medications are silent, their chemical supplies exhausted or spoiled. Therapy, if it occurs at all, happens through informal conversations, community support, and whatever techniques individuals develop to cope with their circumstances. Some communities maintain traditions of storytelling or music, recognizing that these activities provide psychological benefits, even when their practical value is not obvious. The singing of songs, the telling of old stories or creation of new ones, the maintenance of rituals that mark births, deaths, and other life transitions, all serve to create meaning and connection in circumstances that might otherwise feel unbearably bleak. The enduring human spirit manifests most clearly in these small acts of beauty and connection. A carefully tended flower garden that serves no practical purpose but provides aesthetic pleasure. The carving of a wooden toy for a child's birthday. The preservation and performance of a piece of music from before the outbreak. These moments represent choices to invest energy and resources in something beyond mere survival. Assertions that human life should contain beauty and meaning even when the circumstances seem to argue against any such investment. They are acts of defiance against the apparent lesson of the pandemic, that human civilization was fragile, that our values and achievements could be swept away in weeks, that nothing we build or cherish is secure against the forces of biology and chaos. The relationship between survivors and the memory of the pre-pandemic world evolves as time passes. Those who remember life before the outbreak carry that memory as both treasure and burden. The knowledge of what was lost makes the current circumstances more painful, the degradation more obvious. Yet that memory also provides hope, evidence that different ways of living are possible, that humanity once achieved things that seem miraculous from the current vantage point. As these individuals age and die, their memories die with them unless passed on through storytelling and whatever fragmentary records survive. The younger generation receives these stories with a mixture of wonder and skepticism. The world described in Tales of the Past seems almost supernatural. Buildings tall as mountains, vehicles that flew through the air, devices that allowed instant communication across any distance. Some accept these stories as true, maintaining faith in a glorious past. Others suspect exaggeration or myth-making, unable to fully credit that such wonders ever existed. The artifacts that survive from the pre-pandemic world serve as physical evidence that the stories contain at least some truth. A laptop computer, its battery long dead and its screen cracked, nevertheless demonstrates that complex electronics once existed. A medical textbook, its pages yellowed and brittle, preserves knowledge that becomes increasingly valuable as those who remember proper medical techniques pass away. A photograph, faded and water-damaged, shows people in clean clothes standing in front of an intact building, smiling at the camera with an ease that seems impossible to those who have only known hardship and danger. These artifacts are treasured when found, protected and preserved even when their original function can no longer be fulfilled, because they represent connection to the past and hope that some of what was lost might eventually be recovered. The question that haunts all discussions of the post-pandemic world's future is whether human civilization can rebuild, whether the scattered settlements and struggling communities can eventually expand, reconnect, and create something that approaches the scale and sophistication of what was lost. The pessimistic view holds that the infection has permanently altered the conditions for human flourishing, that the spore contamination and persistent infected populations create permanent barriers to large-scale urbanization and the complex social organization it enables. Without dense population centers, without the specialization of labor and accumulation of knowledge that such centers allow, humanity may be locked into a permanent state of subsistence agriculture and small-scale organization. The optimistic view points to human ingenuity and adaptability as reasons for hope. Humanity survived ice ages, supervolcano eruptions, and countless other catastrophes across its evolutionary history. The Cordyceps pandemic, for all its horror, has not driven the species to extinction. Communities exist, children are born, knowledge is preserved and transmitted. With time, with accumulated innovations in dealing with the infected and the environmental hazards they create, future generations might develop methods to clear larger areas, establish safe zones, and begin the process of rebuilding infrastructure and institutions. The path will be long, measured in generations rather than years, but it is not necessarily impossible. Between these extremes lies the more likely reality, a future that is neither complete extinction nor restoration of the past, but something new and strange. The settlements will persist, will slowly expand or contract, based on their success in adapting to the new conditions. Some will fail, their populations killed or scattered by infected attacks, resource depletion, or internal conflicts. Others will thrive, their innovations in agriculture, defense, or social organization allowing them to grow and potentially establish communication with other successful communities. Over decades and centuries, these survivors and their descendants will create new cultures, new traditions, new ways of being human that are shaped by but not enslaved to the pandemic that redefined their world. The small moments of beauty and connection that persist in this diminished world take on cosmic significance precisely because they are not guaranteed, not secure, not protected by any structure larger than individual human choice. When someone chooses to comfort a frightened child, to share scarce food with a neighbor, to create something beautiful that serves no survival function, they are asserting that human life contains value beyond mere continuation. They are maintaining, against overwhelming evidence to the contrary, that compassion, generosity, and creativity still matter. These choices do not change the fundamental conditions of the post-pandemic world. They do not cure the infection or restore the fallen civilization, but they preserve something essential about humanity, some quality of consciousness and care that might otherwise be lost along with everything else the pandemic destroyed. As the decades pass and the initial outbreak recedes into history and then into legend, the world will continue to change. The infected will evolve, the fungus exploring new strategies for survival and reproduction. The human survivors will adapt, will develop new technologies and techniques suited to their circumstances. The natural world will continue its patient reclamation, vegetation slowly consuming the monuments and transforming the landscape into something that future generations will accept as simply how the world is, rather than as a catastrophe to be mourned. In this transformation, both loss and gain are present. The loss is obvious and immense. Billions of lives, accumulated knowledge, artistic and cultural achievements, the dense web of connection that made humanity a global species rather than a collection of isolated communities. But there is also gain, a renewed relationship with the natural world, communities bound by genuine interdependence rather than abstract legal structures, lives lived with full awareness of mortality and fragility, and an enhanced capacity to find meaning and beauty in circumstances that offer neither comfort nor security. The final question is whether this transformation represents progress, regression, or simply change without moral violence. Different survivors would answer differently based on their experiences and values, but perhaps the question itself reflects assumptions about human purpose and direction that the pandemic has revealed as illusory. Civilization was never guaranteed to continue indefinitely. The complexity and sophistication of pre-pandemic society was an evolutionary experiment, one among many possible ways that human intelligence and social organization might manifest. The pandemic ended that experiment, but it did not end humanity. What emerges from the ruins will be different, will lack much that made the old world valuable and remarkable, but it will still be recognizably human. People will still form bonds, will still seek meaning, will still create beauty in whatever materials their circumstances provide. And in the end, perhaps that persistence, that stubborn insistence on finding reasons to continue despite everything, is the truest measure of what it means to be human. Not our achievements or our knowledge, but our refusal to accept that suffering and loss are the final words in our story. The survivors sleep when they sleep in buildings that creak and settle as root systems undermine foundations, as moisture works its patient corruption of materials that were never meant to last forever without maintenance. They wake to guard duty rotations, to agricultural labour, to the 1,000 small tasks required to maintain existence at the edge of viability. They teach their children what they can, practical skills for survival, fragments of history and culture from the world before, and whatever wisdom they have accumulated about how to live with dignity in circumstances that offer little support for such aspirations. The clicking of infected echoes in the distance, a constant reminder of the threat that never sleeps. But between those sounds, in the spaces of relative safety and calm, human voices still rise in conversation, in laughter, in song. The world has changed, civilization has fallen, and the future remains uncertain. But humanity endures, diminished but not extinguished, carrying forward the long story of consciousness, attempting to make meaning from the raw material of existence, one small moment at a time, one choice to care and create and connect, against all evidence that such choices matter in any cosmic sense. They matter because we choose to act as if they matter, and in that choice, in that defiant assertion of value in a universe indifferent to our survival, lies whatever future humanity might yet claim.